We begin our report with breaking news. The Colorado Supreme Court has ruled Donald Trump is disqualified from appearing on the state's ballot for the presidential primary election in 2024. A group of Colorado voters filed a lawsuit trying to block Trump from the ballot in September. The court agreed, saying Trump cannot be president under the 14th Amendment, which states that anyone engaging in insurrection cannot hold public office. The decision will almost certainly be appealed. CBS News election law contributor David Becker joins us now. Okay, David, other states have rejected the 14th Amendment. So what different road did the Colorado Supreme Court go down?
Well, since we're in the primary process, what every other state has basically found was that it was too early to bring this case. Sometimes they found that the plaintiffs didn't have standing, or that more likely that this was just the primary process, that it was the process by which the Republican Party chose its nominee. And the Republican Party has a lot of latitude to do that however it wants to, given the First Amendment right of association. And so every other court refused to consider the merits of this case at the current stage. Colorado was different from the very beginning. The lower court actually found that Donald Trump engaged in insurrection under the meaning of the 14th Amendment, but also found that the presidency was not an office of the United States as it's defined in the 14th Amendment. That was somewhat of an unusual decision, and most people who looked at that decision and thought that's a strange outcome. Most believe that, including myself, that the presidency, of course, is an office under the 14th Amendment, that when the 14th Amendment was drafted in the aftermath of the Constitution, its drafters clearly intended to prevent someone like Jefferson Davis or Robert E. Lee from taking the presidency. And so it was anticipated that that would be overturned on appeal. What wasn't anticipated was that the finding of an insurrection would also be upheld on appeal. And that's what Colorado ultimately determined, that under Colorado state law, someone who's disqualified from the presidency under the 14th Amendment cannot even appear on the primary ballot.
So just a quick nuts and bolts question before we go back to the ruling, and I don't want to lose anybody, but what happens in the meantime? Is the Colorado, I mean, they have to print ballots and all that kind of stuff. What do we know about just the logistics of getting him back on the ballot if he were to want to be back on the ballot?
So to give credit to the Colorado Supreme Court, they did think about that to some degree, and they stayed their own decision until at least January 4th, meaning that Donald Trump is still eligible to appear on the Colorado ballot. I don't believe it's been printed yet. There's probably a little bit of time for that. And then if, as anticipated, Donald Trump appeals to the United States Supreme Court and they choose to take the case, which I think is an almost certainty. They don't have to take the case, but I think it's extremely likely that they will take this case, then that stay persists. In other words, his name will remain on the ballot until the United States Supreme Court rules to uphold the Colorado Supreme Court ruling if that happens.
So it seems to me, of the 3 points that you've made about this decision, it seems to me that while other courts may have ruled that they have no standing over how a party chooses to pick its nominee, it does seem like courts do have something to say about actual elections to federal office. The second question of whether a president is an officer of the United States also seems to be one that would be passed by pretty quickly. The third question that strikes me, though, is one about insurrection. And how does one define insurrection? I remember at least at one point when talking about conspiracies, there was, I was once told, if you just have a little drop in the conspiracy, you're a part of it. In other words, you don't have to be the leader of the conspiracy. Is there any definition for, is it a drop of insurrection, a little bit of flirting with insurrection, or do you have to have been the grand insurrectionist?
So it certainly doesn't mean you have to be the mastermind. It just means you had to engage in it. But especially with regard to the presidency, we have never had a court, especially the Supreme Court, determine this. And that's going to be up for these 9 justices to decide ultimately. Were former President Trump's actions on January 6th, where he incited the mob to march to the Capitol, that mob, incited by his words, attacked the Capitol, broke into the Capitol, and sought to interfere with the January 6th official proceedings of Congress as it just officially and ministerially counted the ballots. We already knew the outcome. That's going to be at issue. And of course, this is also at issue in the D.C. case brought by Jack Smith, the special counsel, which is currently scheduled to go to trial on March 4th. They're not specifically looking at whether or not that was an insurrection. They're looking at a variety of other federal statutes there, but a lot of the factual determinations are going to be the same. Whether or not former President Donald Trump, and this is the exact language in the 14th Amendment, engaged in insurrection.
And David, who did the authors of the 14th Amendment think would be ruling on this question of insurrection?
Well, I think they thought it was going to be the Supreme Court if it ever came to it. I think they had a pretty clear idea of what that meant in the aftermath of the Civil War, of course. And of course, what this was meant to do at the time was to prevent, it's not just the presidency, it's any office of the United States. It was to prevent active members of the Confederacy from being members of the federal government in the aftermath of the Civil War. That being said, we're looking at it in a different context now, of course, and it's something we're going to need to, we're going to hopefully get the United States Supreme Court to rule on. One very positive aspect of today's decision, whether you agree with it or not, is that this likely means that the United States Supreme Court is going to rule on this issue sooner rather than later, which is really important for the election officials all around the country. As you alluded to, John, they've got to plan for an election. They've got to print ballots. They've got to figure out how this is all going to work, and the voters need to understand who they're going to have an option to vote for. And so getting a decision on this from the United States Supreme Court sooner rather than later in either direction is a good thing for us.
David Becker, thank you so much. And now Robert Costa joins us from Washington. Bob, your first reaction to this ruling?
It's potentially one of the biggest moments so far in the Republican presidential race and in the 2024 presidential election, because you have a former president of the United States, the Republican frontrunner, now being disqualified from a crucial battleground state's primary ballot, complicating his entire path forward, not only to the nomination, but to the presidency. And this collides with everything else that's going on with Trump legally, whether it's the ongoing civil fraud trial in New York or especially that January 6th trial scheduled to come up in March of 2024.
And Bob, do you think this changes the conversation at all? I mean, we can imagine there will be a rallying. We've seen a rallying around the former president, and we've already seen some of his allies saying this is election interference. But if you get past that and go back to the idea of whether the former president was involved on January 6th or the many months leading up to an effort to overthrow an election, do you think that question comes back up again? His opponents have pretty much been avoiding that question for most of the primary contest.
They've been avoiding it directly, but indirectly, John, as you know, we've seen so many of Trump's rivals talk about electability questions. And this gets to the core of the electability question with former President Trump. How can you be elected if you can't maybe even appear on the ballot in a particular state like Colorado, which is so critical in a general election campaign? What you're going to see now, based on my conversations with Republican sources over the last hour or two, is that former Ambassador Nikki Haley and her allies are not maybe going to take this on directly, but they're going to lean into that electability argument against Trump and say, as Haley has said in recent days on the campaign trail, that Trump equals chaos. Even if you like him, if you like his policies, he's too chaotic to be the Republican nominee. Now, Haley hasn't distanced herself in the same way former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie has, and you can expect him to certainly raise serious questions about Trump's viability as a candidate based on this Colorado Supreme Court ruling. But Haley's the one to watch in terms of donor momentum and whether some top Republicans start to say enough is enough.
You know, Bob, I'm just looking back at what was said by the leader of the Republicans in the House at the time and the leader of the Republicans in the Senate. Kevin McCarthy, then the leader of the Republicans, said the president bears responsibility for Wednesday's attack on Congress by mob rioters. That would suggest he is, in fact, responsible for an insurrection. Mitch McConnell, the leader of Senate Republicans, said there is no question President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of that day. How has the party gotten around that idea that he is both responsible for an insurrection, but it's okay to give him 4 more years?
I just sat down with the outgoing speaker, Kevin McCarthy, in recent days for CBS Sunday Morning, and I brought up that flip. He said Trump was to blame for the insurrection. Now he has endorsed Trump. And so many Republicans have rallied around Trump. What's intriguing to me as a reporter is there is soft support for Trump in many of these states. Yes, he has his base, but there's soft support among traditional Republicans, independent-leaning Republicans. And the question is, do they start to move? Does this really start to move them? Maybe not Jack Smith, but to say he's maybe not going to make the ballot. Is this someone who can carry our standard for us going into a general election? Again, John, you're right. The Republican Party over the past near decade has been transformed by Trump and largely been consumed by him. At the same time, there's still a bit of political oxygen for those who say it's time to go in a different direction. The question is there enough time to really let that argument settle in?
So, Bob, you're going to be getting on the phone and calling around. What's the next set of questions you're interested in? We've already addressed a lot of it, but what else is curious for you about this moment, which is, you know, on the one hand, it's an extraordinary thing. We've never been here before, but we've never been here before a lot in the last 5 or 6 years.
The most extraordinary thing to me is the specter on the horizon of possible, well, let's just say a roiling debate at the least over the role of the Supreme Court in the United States. On the day of the funeral of the late Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, you're now having the court come back into the fore of American politics in a way we haven't really seen for 23 years since Bush v. Gore in 2000 to decide that presidential election. Now you have the Supreme Court dealing with cases regarding January 6th and defendants, and it's almost certainly going to have to deal with the Trump status in Colorado and his status on the ballot. This is going to be heard. Our legal sources are already telling CBS News. And so you have the Supreme Court with its conservative majority, part of this presidential campaign, part of this national debate in a real way. And as much as Chief Justice John Roberts might not like that reality, it's the reality.
Excellent point. Robert Costa from Washington. Thanks a lot, Bob.
Thanks, John.
Now let's go to CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto. So, Anthony, obviously there's not been any polling on this, and it's always dangerous to extrapolate. But, and let's just say that again, but from the polling you've looked at, do you have a sense of how this is likely to be interpreted by Trump's supporters within his party? You and I have talked about when you have a mindset about institutions, rulings from institutions are received differently. What do your numbers tell you that would give us some wisdom in this moment?
Well, John, start with what his supporters feel about January 6th, which is kind of the sort of opening part of all of this. And that is they've been mixed, but largely okay with what's come about. Because while a majority have said that they disapprove of what went on in terms of the actions, they've also called it defending freedom when we ask them to describe what happened. And in a larger sense, John, what we've seen from his supporters is that even as the other half of the country, even as we've had 51% of the country, says that they think he tried not only to stay in office, but to do so through illegal means. His supporters have often told us in the polling that they feel like if he did in fact try to stay in office, that he had a reason, at least a rationale for doing so, or a legal means to try. And all of that is a bit of backdrop to saying that one would not necessarily expect this to move the needle given what we have seen before. Now, again, look, having said that, and to your point about institutions is an excellent one. At what point does perhaps a Supreme Court ruling change that? At what point does it become harder for him to argue, as he has successfully for his supporters, that these are the effects of attacks from the left, that these are politically motivated, which up until now, much of what's gone on, that's how supporters have seen it. That, I think, remains an open question. But yeah, so far, we haven't seen evidence that things like this have moved that needle, John.
All right, Anthony Salvanto, thank you. Republican presidential candidates are descending on Iowa with less than 4 weeks left until the caucuses. And CBS News political reporter Aaron Navarro and campaign reporter Nidia Cavazos join me now from Iowa. Okay, so Aaron, what's any response to this ruling, which is just not very old? So what are you hearing?
The Democrat Party, pardon me, Yeah, I'm here at an event in Ankeny for DeSantis right outside Des Moines. There has not been a response. He had just done a stop in Marshalltown, and it was kind of in between stops when that ruling dropped. But one thing to note is from talking to his team, his campaign, is throughout this race, one obstacle they've run into is the bumps that Trump gets after indictments, after developments in his legal cases when it comes to Republican primary electorate voters. So it'll be interesting to see what that does to the race going forward.
And what about you, Nydia? You hearing anything?
I am currently outside an event that's supposed to be taking place at this very moment for Haley. And of course, we're going to be watching out for any possible remarks. But so far, we have received word of Vivek Ramaswamy, who is also president in Iowa campaigning. And he is currently tweeting saying he's pledging to remove his own name from the Colorado ballot. And he's also calling on other candidates to follow his lead. He's calling this decision plain wrong. And although that it would very much help him if Trump wasn't in the race, this isn't about him. And he says this is simply not American. Of course, this is still developing, and we can for sure expect other candidates to weigh in.
The kind of statement a candidate who is so low in the polls can make. So to both of you, let's switch from this news to we've had a lot of punditry in life, and I'd like both of you to tell me what it's like out there. What does it look like? What does it feel like? What interesting thing have you heard on the campaign trail? Nydia, I'll start with you.
Well, you know, it's interesting to see that we're less than 30 days away from the Iowa caucus. Until this day, we have a lot of voters who come to these events and they say that they're still undecided. We're a couple of days away from it, and they say that they're still pretty much trying to choose between Trump, DeSantis, and Haley. And a lot of the voters that I've been talking to, specifically at Nikki Haley's event, say that they're supporting Trump. They've supported him in the past, but because of everything that's been going on, they're sort of here to listen into what she has to say. They think that she's very similar, has very similar policies to Trump. And so they're here to just take a look at what she has to say. And just yesterday, I was speaking to this one voter who said she just happened to find out that Nikki Haley was going to be in her hometown. And so she decided to come in and listen. But she did clarify that she was a Trump supporter. I spoke to her before the event. And after the event finished, she made it a point to come and look for me and said, "Can you please interview me again?" And I said, "Sure, why not?" And she really wanted to express that she that night was changing her mind and was now going to be supporting Nikki Haley. And she specifically mentioned that, yes, she was tired of Trump's chaos and specifically the legal cases behind him. And she was just very impressed by Nikki Haley's foreign policy and her experience as a UN ambassador. So those are a couple of stories that we're hearing out here in the field in Iowa.
That's great. And Aaron, let me ask you a version of the same question. We learned time and again in campaigns not to discount, and that story is a perfect example of it, what the voters are feeling and seeing. So the national image is that Trump has this going away. What does it feel like on the ground in terms of his formidable lead in the party?
All of the sentiment now.
Well, that's right, and it's been a question I've been asking the people at DeSantis events throughout the summer and until now is community matching what you see in the polls. And it's hard to find a voter that doesn't think Trump is the front runner in this race, but a lot of voters, and obviously they're curious enough to come to DeSantis events, they're telling me that they don't think Trump's lead is as big as they think. They think it's closer. And it's not so much 100% love for DeSantis or Haley. It's that they have fatigue of Trump. They don't think he can be electable, and they're kind of tired of the legal cases surrounding him.
Aaron Navarro and Nydia Cavazos, thank you so much for joining us from the trail.